Welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast, proudly presented by Venture Hunting and Outdoors. If you're like us and passionate about hunting, spearfishing, and many other outdoor-related pursuits, with an eagerness to fast-track your learning, then this is the podcast for you. What is happening, legends? Welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast. Today, it's going to be a solo ep, just me, James Doumtsis, by myself. Aiden's abroad and sadly can't join us on the podcast. So we're going to be doing a rut calling masterclass today, and that's sort of coming off the back of last week's Q&A sort of podcast, where we've just been inundated since doing episode 5 and 6 on sort of red and fallow deer biology and calling in and, you know, tactics for all different stages of the rut. And we've just had so many questions specifically around calling. So we just wanted to address them in their sort of own podcast. I don't think this one's going to be crazy long, but just wanted to dive a little bit deeper and just make sure that everyone's up to date. Like Aiden and I just wanted to make sure that when you guys are going out there on the mountain, you know, there's people who are already hearing roars and croaks and stuff like that. And we just wanted to make sure that you guys had all the tips and tactics, were fully up to it with calling and all the audible cues that, you know, make the rut so special. So we just want to make sure that you're going to have the best chance of securing, you know, the buck of a lifetime or stag of a lifetime, but also potentially just getting your first critter on the deck. So we'll jump in and enjoy this podcast.
Venture Hunting and Outdoors is Australia's premier hunting retailer. Venture started from a team of passionate hunters with the mission to give Australian hunters the resource they deserve. Through community events, top quality gear, exclusive deals, and expert guidance, Venture is more than a hunting store. It's a community. Check out their incredible mega store in Brisbane today, or head to their website to shop all things hunting and outdoors.
So I just wanted to open this podcast with a disclaimer, and that's just because like this podcast is going to be all around, you know, verbal cues, calling in bucks and stags. But I also just wanted to touch on the fact that it's not always necessarily the best thing to call. It does have inherent risks. And so, you know, I don't know how many times I've called an animal and then it hasn't escalated as I've wanted it to, and the animal's gone away silently, or I may have busted them or something like that. And obviously hindsight's, you know, one of these beautiful things that you go, oh, maybe I should have moved in silently. And so what we're going to try and do is, and it's not to say that you can't call and then move in silently afterwards, but it's just trying to sort of decipher for you guys and show that, you know, maybe calling, especially if something is already calling, isn't necessarily that golden ticket. Like most of the time, I find that I am actually moving in silently. It's only those like very special occasions. I'd say it'd be less than 50% of the time where I'm actually like calling an animal into me. So just keep that in the back of your mind, that sometimes actually calling and giving away your location isn't necessarily the best thing. And I just wanted to get that out there before we sort of jump into all the actual calling tactics. So here on the Twin Elements podcast, we love poor analogies. So here's one that I just wanted to get out there for you guys. And when you're calling to an animal, essentially, like what I like to think of myself as is you're a salesman or a saleswoman, and what you're actually trying to sell is, it sounds a bit sort of dark, but what you're trying to sell is, you know, an arrow or bullet through the chest. And so what you're trying to do is say or do whatever you need to get that animal into range to be able to be successful in this hunt. And so that can include, you know, what I've split up into male calls in the sense of croaks and roars, but also obviously female calls, so hind calls and doe calls, but also non-verbal cues, like it might be raking a tree or just, you know, rolling some rocks or something like that. Trying to convince that animal to come into your location, or if you're a rifle hunter, it may just be, you know, exposing themselves on the other side of the mountain so that you can get that shot. But the big thing here is like, what we've got a heap of, you know, different aces, I guess, up our sleeve. And what we're trying to do is use them all in combination to, at the end of the day, you're trying to paint a picture to convince that animal that they would like to come over to you. And that may be from a reproductive point of view, in the sense of, you know, using female calls. And obviously this is like, this time of year is all around, the rut's all around, you know, breeding success, I guess. So using female calls to try and get that animal to come into your location. But it can also be defensive. So it can also be, well, you know, I need to go and defend the girls that I have, or the girls that I'd like to have, or my potential scrape or patch of turf. And I need to go and fight this potential other suitor, or defend my area from this, you know, this foreign male that's coming in to take my girls or take my scrape or something like that. So you're trying to play on those emotions, and you're trying to use the different calls that you've got to, you know, get that animal into your location and hopefully be successful. So the first calling, like in a lot of these stuff that we've already touched on, it's just that I wanted to dive a little bit deeper and sort of make sure that you guys are 100% over it. And so the first one that we've spoken about is location calls. So we spoke about this both on episode 5 and 6 with the red deer. So I'm not going to jump into too much detail around that, but for the new listeners, like what we've previously described, so you're getting up on that ridge early in the morning. You know, we like to be 3/4 of the way up the ridge. That's where we find that not only that your voice sort of projects the best, but also because that's generally the way that it sort of works with our hunt strategy. Like we're getting 3/4 of the way up the ridge, and then we're contouring the ridges. You'll actually find that the stags and the bucks are very similar in the sense that it makes a lot, like they're not necessarily going down into a gully and then up the other side. They're going to contour the top of the ridges because it's a lot easier for them to find girls doing that way. And so first thing in the morning, we like to get up well and truly before first light, because often, as we've said, you know, especially with red deer and stuff, we find that like an hour before first light, you might have a couple of stags roaring, but then as the sun starts popping its little head up over the hill, that can drop down to 0, if not just one stag, especially in the sort of early, like during the peak rut period, they may carry on through the day a bit longer, especially if it's cooler and stuff like that. But definitely in like this peak pre-rut and post-rut period, where it's sort of when they're not running crazy, we find that they may just shut off as soon as the sun comes up. So we like to get up that 3/4 of the way up the ridge. And I like to say, like, if this is first thing in the morning, and I'm just going to go through location calls like all through the day now, but if they're first thing in the morning, then I sometimes necessarily won't call if a buck's croaking or if a red stag's calling. Like, I personally don't think that you can tell the difference between you know, the maturity or anything like that of a red stag that's calling, and definitely not with a buck. The only disclaimer with that is unless like there's stags that have sort of weird audible differences and stuff, and I've seen that before. Same with fallow. Like, you can get ones that just have, like, you know, whether it's an old buck and their vocal cords are like calloused and breaking down, and it might sound like bow, 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 rather than like, you know, and so then you may be able to tell. But overall, for the most part, like they're all pretty similar. So like, I mean, if generally speaking, if something's calling, like if you've got a couple of animals calling at first light, especially with red deer, I won't move in on an animal. Generally, I'm in like 3/4 of the way up a ridge, and that ridge is also a very good glassing position. Like, it's hopefully in the center of the basin, which I can see a lot of ridges and stuff like that. Because what I'll do is I'll start taking like mental notes on, okay, there's something on, you know, that hill there, and there's something on Heartbreak Hill over there, and there's something on, you know, Fire Hill over there, and there's something on, you know, Sawtooth Hill over there, and blah blah blah. And you start taking notes on where all these animals are. If it's with bucks and stuff like that, like if there's, because obviously bucks are going to hold to a scrape and have a dominant scrape more so. So if there's a mature buck that you're targeting on a scrape, and you can hear you know, a buck on that scrape, then I'd probably go to that buck, hopefully expecting that it's going to be that buck. But I mean, you don't know, like a bigger buck could have come in overnight. He could be off chasing a doe, and so that, you know, a little buck could be sitting on there with 10 girls croaking and stuff like that. Like, you just don't know. But with fallow, because they're sort of a lot more localized, they're not nomadic like red deer, I would be going to a call if like, I'm not going to sit there and analyze, you know, like, yeah, I'm not going to sit there and analyze, oh, which one. Whereas with red deer, like, I'd probably stay up high and then glass and see, I may move in a direction. Like if I think, if I've seen a red deer the night before, or I think a stag's hanging in a certain area and stuff, it may cause me to move. But I really want to like analyze, especially sort of at the stage where Aiden and I are at now, where like we're not targeting, and this is obviously a difference between some people here. Like we're not targeting any buck or any stag. We're targeting sort of the biggest one, I guess, that we can find. Whereas if you're just happy with any stag or any buck, then that's the thing. Like I would definitely be running in the dark to try and close the distance. And as the sun's coming up, be right on that stag, or right on that especially that buck, sitting like that 100 meters off. And then, but the thing is, when you're doing that too, like if you do close in the gap on a buck or a stag at first light, make sure that I would actually like wait for it to like give it 10 or 15 minutes, be thinking about the thermals and your location and where you're going to be, the prevailing wind direction. And I would actually sit there for like 10 or 15 minutes. It's probably going to be the hardest 10 or 15 minutes of your life. And I would actually let it get properly light before, especially if you're going to move in silently, because I can see what's going to happen. You're going to be thinking in the back of your mind, yeah, it's fine. Like I can move in now. I can see fine. And you're going to miss a doe, or you're going to miss a hind, or like, and red deer and fallow just blend into the grass, like even on an open hillside. Like it's incredible in that really low light setting. Cause I genuinely do believe, like we obviously use a lot of movement, but having been hunting red deer now for a couple of weeks flat out, like, and having this happen to me, when moving in on stuff, like red deer, especially, like you're used to seeing that red and their arse, but they just blend into the grass. Like when obviously, like we need light in our eyes to actually be able to detect color. And so when it's, still that really gray light that's starting to just filter over the hill, we can't see colors, and so we can't see the red. And so like you can see the shape of a red deer, but you don't sort of recognize it as easy. And people obviously rush in and stuff, and then that's where you miss a hind or something like that, and you bust the stalk. But going back up to the location calls, so yeah, like that first light, if things are calling and you're targeting like one of those more mature animals, I'd certainly start drifting towards animals, just because it's going to make it also easier to locate with your binos and stuff. But if you're trying to find the most mature animal and stuff, then I'd be using the binos, find out which animal you're going to be chasing, and then that's going to go into whether you're moving in silently or whether you're going in and going to start like this calling sequence, which we'll discuss a little bit later on. The next thing is, like, if you get up on the ridge and you've been sitting there for 20 minutes and haven't heard anything, then that's where I would personally sort of start the party. Croaking obviously is very straightforward and repetitious. I can't actually do it. If you're sick of having dull knives in the kitchen or whilst out fishing or hunting, then check out the Kimbo rolling knife sharpener. Its easy design means anyone can have knives razor sharp in minutes. Australian owned and backed by a 90-day money-back guarantee, it's a perfect gift for anyone that loves cooking or in the outdoor space. Use code TWINELEMENTS15 to get 15% off your next order. The only variance that we've sort of found with calling, with croaking and stuff, is just the volume. Like there's not really that much of a difference in sort of the tone of the croaks, whereas obviously with red deer, as we've discussed, with like the sort of foundations that we want you guys to use with red deer calling, especially like the roars between like the timing and the tone, there's plenty of variations and sort of emotional sort of inputs that you can put in with red deer to really display, like if you're just doing a location roar, or like, no, I'm really pissed off and I want to like hurt you, and so on and so forth. So yeah, with the red deer, like there's plenty of sort of inputs there where I guess you can like sort of put your own personal zest and own personal twist on it. But it's also important to use that sort of tone in the back of the mind to see, and this is what we'll sort of get into with the actual calling stuff. It's like you're doing whatever you need to get the best response out of, a red deer. And especially like you can see that as well in a fallow buck with, how loud he's croaking and how aggressively he's croaking as well. So if you're sitting across from, just say you're sitting 150 meters away from a fallow buck, and you croak back at them and they just sort of like, and just do a couple of croaks back, then you're like, okay, he's only like, he acknowledges that I'm here, but he's not really like feeling it. You know what I mean? Like that's, but then all of a sudden just say you doe call and do a couple of, And then all of a sudden he goes nuts, and like the actual volume in which he's doing it. But then he also sits there and for 45 seconds flat, just go, well, then it's like, okay, croaking clearly isn't the go here. Like doe calls is going to be the go. And so what you're trying to do is find the call that is really sort of like making them, I don't know, like you're trying to tap into what they want to hear, like what's going to get them across the line. Like I said, going back to that sales rep analogy, it's like what's going to get them to come to your location, or what's going to get them, you know, really fired up. Because like, it's one thing to it's one thing for you and a red stag or a buck to be sitting opposite sides of the mountain and croaking flat out. And like, if you're a rifle hunter, then that's maybe all you need. Like if you're in pretty tight country and stuff like that, you may just want a red stag to walk out of some thick bush and then just shoot it, which is sick. But if you need to shoot, like, you know, if it's really thick cover, even for a rifle guy or girl, you might not be able to shoot, and you may need to get them to come right in before you can shoot them. And obviously that's where most bow hunters live anyway, where it's like, you know, you can be sitting across the ridge calling all you want, but it's like at the end of the day, you're trying to find that little call it could either be like, you know, a female or male call, or one of these like non-typical calls, like, you know, raking a tree, or, you know, you might splash some water at a wallow or something like that. You might even, you know, we'll get into another little secret one later on, but you're trying to find the call that flicks the switch for that buck or that stag to come in right into you, so that then you can hopefully, you know, ethically take that animal. And so you need to be sort of gauging your response, or the response from the animal. And so, I keep sort of getting into it, but I just want to really touch on the location stuff, because I find it really important that, like, obviously step one of all of this is like locating the actual animal that you're trying to target or hunt. And so another time, like I feel like in the other podcast, we really heavily discussed location calls during like early morning and stuff like that, but just going into it a little bit deeper with the, like, I do location calls like all the time, because especially, like I said, I'm only mainly talking about red deer here, but I would do it with fallow too if I could. And that is like, I would be like, so just say you call and nothing responds, and then you sit there for another 15 minutes and you do another roar or something like that. And this is where the tone of it is like really important, especially for red deer, like what we've discussed, because like if you're just doing a general like location roar, which I'll put in right now. So this is like, I'm just going to have to record it separately so it doesn't like blow out the mics. But this is what I would call like a general, just, you know, red deer location roar. And I'll just do another example now. Still a location roar, still that flat, very monotone roar, but just with a couple of notes in it as another example for you guys. So that was just done through my like Phelps bugle tube, which I'll be carrying around this roar, just to sort of project and sort of give a bit more amplification and sort of tone, a bit deeper vibes to the actual roars. But obviously, so you can hear that's like a very flat monotone roar. I just did a couple of ones in there so you can like sort of feel it, because there's no two roars that are ever going to be the same. It's sort of like voices and how we talk and dialects and, you know, all that type of stuff. But at least you can get the feel. And I'll like walk up a ridge or a valley system, just constantly doing that. So I'll do it, just say I get on the mountain at 5 a.m. It's getting light at 6:20 at the moment. So, or 6:30. So just say I'll call after 20 minutes of hearing nothing. And then if I don't hear anything, I'll wait another 10 minutes. Sometimes I might even call straight away. So I'll do like a roar. And then if I get nothing, like 2 minutes later, because it's nothing to hear red stags sitting on a hill just like by themselves or like projecting out, especially if they don't have hinds, and just calling and calling and calling. And obviously bucks, like, you know, bucks are trying to attract does in. So never, like, I don't know, you can be cautious of animals sort of becoming educated to your calling and stuff like that, especially like you like I feel like everyone's got their own calling, like sounds, in the sense that, you know, like if I've been hunting with someone for a couple of days, like by the end of it, you know, I could probably be on the other side of a ridge, and if I called, they'd be like, oh, that's probably James calling. You know what I mean? So like you've got, like, everyone sounds similar with their roaring, and that's in some ways like carrying an electronic game cooler or something like that can be great to break it up, because then obviously you've got more sort of tones and dialects and that type of thing when you're calling, because it's not just your voice every time. But yeah, when you're like calling, then I'll start moving and croaking if I could, or roaring. And I'll do that all the way through the morning. And so like and this is what I wanted to sort of get to, because some of the best responses I've ever had at calling with bucks and reds have been in the middle of the day, where like you're just doing a very, like, you know, especially like I said, it's sort of hard because I'm only talking about mainly reds here purely because I can't croak. But if I could, I would be doing this exact same thing with bucks. But so I've had so many successful hunts where in the middle of the day you do just this like very like, and normally you're in pretty tight country, like normally, and that's one of the benefits, like when you get the response, they're not normally like super aggressive, like across the gully. Like it's normally because you're like moving your way through some like decent bedding areas, and you're just like halfway up a ridge. You might be doing a little bit of rattling as well for fallow and stuff, and you're like checking in on spots, and you do this little roar, and then all of a sudden from like 200 meters away you get another little roar. And so what that does is, depending on the country, it's like you've pretty much located exactly where that red stag or that buck is going to be for the next 2 or 3 hours, especially if it's like 11 o'clock or, you know, 12 o'clock, because like you've found where that buck's most likely bedded, like he's either croaking on a scrape that he's bedded on or something like that, or in some thick bush that he's bedded on, or you've found a red that's just given out like a little moan, generally from a bed. And so if you're in more open country, well, all of a sudden you've got a stationary animal. The wind's probably the best it's going to be all day. The thermals are moving up. And so then you've got this prime stalking situation where for a bow hunter, for a rifle hunter, it can be a little bit more difficult, especially if they're in like super thick bush. But if you're a bow hunter, then you've got this prime situation where you've just located an animal that's going to be stationary. The wind's really good, you know, and you can take your time to move in. And in this case, I actually probably wouldn't do any more calling. I mean, I've had a lot of success, I guess, with calling at this time of the day to locate. I personally haven't had, because once they're bedded, it's one of these things, like, and you can try both. Like there's nothing wrong with like you and a stag or you and a buck. Like you can start doe calling at a buck and he might croak, and you can do that for 10 minutes and it sort of just like de-escalates and unwinds, and then you can then move in silently and he'll probably be, or hope that he's in the same situation. Same with a red stag. Like you can roar at a red stag for 10 minutes and he can be in some pretty gnarly thick bush, and you can roar, he'll roar, and then you're both like emulating bedded red stags, and then it just doesn't sort of go anywhere, and then you can like move in afterwards. But I've had plenty of times with reds where I found that, yeah, you roar and roar, but often they're like in some pretty thick country. They also probably have girls there bedded and stuff, so it's like, why would I go even 100 meters to go and fight someone when I've got my girls tucked up in some really thick stuff? And so that's where you're going to need to get in there nice and close, which is, you know, makes for some really exciting hunting. But the benefit is you've got everything stacked in your favor. You've got all the time in the world. It's not like it's 6 o'clock and he's in thick bush and he's moving and the girls are up on their feet. It's like the wind's good. Even if there's 10 or 15 deer or 20 deer tucked in this thick area, it's like they're not moving. Their senses are depressed. And so, I mean, like some of the hunting success that I've found has been like the middle of the day. But obviously you've just, like as you've probably heard from Aiden and I, with our enthusiasm and everything like that, we sort of spend a lot of time on the mountain, because equally you can't shoot them from the camp, or you can't shoot them from the couch at home. I mean, not to say that you can't shoot them from camp. You definitely can. There's plenty of stories that people who shot great stags from, walking outside of the cabin, and there's a stag walking past or a buck walking past or whatever, especially if you're in like a pretty cool camp. That's like you wake up in the morning, you hear roaring reds and croaking bucks and stuff. But the likelihood that you shoot one from camp is significantly less than on the mountain. So we tend to spend as much time on the mountain while the sun's up as we possibly can. So yeah, but definitely just wanted to touch on that with like the locating. You can carry on, like if you're hunting all day, like you can literally just every 20 minutes or half an hour do one of those location rules or location croaks. And I don't think as long as you sound realistic, and that's one of these things where it's like, go on YouTube, watch roaring red stags, watch croaking bucks, hone your skill now. Half an hour of watching YouTube roaring reds can make the difference between you sounding like an ass on the side of a hill, an ass being a donkey, or an actual, like a really good red stag. So just do a little practice. Like you can do it like in the car on the way to work, even just put up YouTube videos. Like no one has to hear it. My girlfriend hates it because I'll be like driving and all of a sudden I'll go, meh. And she'll like look at me and be like, you're a dick. But yeah, I'll practice calling, especially it's one of these things that I'll get like really excited about something and I'll actually start roaring, or do like a roar, especially if I just think about the rut and it's like right here now. So I'm just like G'd up and so excited. But I do heaps of calling in the car and stuff like that. And I think it's just a good time because no one can hear you. You can practice. That's how I got like I wouldn't even say good at calling elk. I'm okay at calling elk. There's still so much I need to learn, and even just how to do it properly. But that's how I learned, like just practicing at home and practicing at in the car, especially like with a cow call in your mouth, just driving around. So just do the same thing and just learn how to call. And I don't think, as long as you sound like a roaring stag, I don't think there's a problem with it. And I think I've had like a lot of responses and people sort of say, oh, do you feel like you call too much and stuff like that? But then at the end of the day, I guess when like you're on the side of the hill and stuff and you've got things responding fairly consistently, it's one of these things that's sort of hard to argue against. And I mean, like, I think if you're doing it day, and that's where like it becomes important in the sense that if you're doing it like day after day after day, calling in animals and then like them winding you or busting you or seeing you or that type of thing, then obviously they catch on to what you sound like as a roar. And I think just that general hunting pressure increases. They generally sort of start shutting down and they may not roar as much. But certainly like, yeah, if you're being like very conservative about how you're doing it and just doing like a general, like, cause they're doing it too. So you're just sort of fitting into the environment. And that's where like, with the red deer, tone becomes really important. And that's where, making sure that you're not sort of educating all these animals, becomes really important too. And then, you can have some like great success, but I just wanted to, go over and just make sure everything was covered fully with the location calling aspect of things. Obviously this like location stuff really is only the first step of the calling sort of sequence. So like once you've got either animals calling or you've found animals, then we go into the next part, which is like actually engaging in these dialogues. And I just wanted to break that down further, about sort of the art of calling in animals.
Whether it's hunting, fishing, hiking, or any other activity in the great outdoors, Dog and Gun Coffee is ready to fuel your adventures. Their preloaded drip filters are a game changer and help you enjoy cafe quality coffee in the wild. Their dark roast, the Samba blend, is my personal favourite. The legends over at Dog and Gun Coffee have extended their support to you to help us discover your brew of choice today. Use code TWIN10, that's numerical number 10, at checkout for $10 off your first order.
So the next part now is actually sort of that song and dance of actually the sort of the dialogue that you're going to have with this buck or this stag once you've located them and you've just sort of, you're within audible range, I guess, is obviously very important. And so the big decision here is like, do you even need to make some calls? Because obviously, like if you've got a roaring red stag in the middle of the day that you've just located, or a buck, you may just spot and stalk move in on that animal, as we've just previously discussed. Equally, if you've got a buck on a scrape that you can hear, that is making noise, or you've just done a croak and it just started and it's on a scrape that quite well, and you've done your research, that you need to cut up this little this little gut in the gully and get up this little gully and then get in, and you can walk in on the game trail and be and be 70 yards off him at first light and so on and so forth. Like maybe you don't need to make a sound. And so it's just like, it's this dynamic game of cat and mouse that you're playing. And so it's hugely important to think, do I even need to make a sound in this situation to be successful? Because sometimes overcalling and calling and educating these animals, like I previously just said, like if you don't need to call, then calling can just be an educational opportunity for you if it does, stuff up, I guess. And so I guess the biggest thing that I really wanted to like harp on about with calling is like, you need to do whatever call. Like if you decide, okay, I need to call this red stag into my location, or, if you're a rifle person, I need to call to get this stag to expose himself so I can get a shot across the gully or get a shot in general because they're in really thick bush. And so it's like, you need to do the call, whatever call is getting the best response or seems to be working the best at that time and at that moment. So the other thing that makes this sort of, I guess like, that like things have sort of like a call, like if you're roaring at 500 meters, just say, to a red stag, it may have a different impact than if you're calling at 50 meters, for example. So there's also the distances that become important. And like if you're not getting the response, I know that the demographic of our podcast listeners are mainly male, so I'll use this analogy in the sense that if you're a female, like often when it comes to doe calls and hind calls, like if you're doing a doe call from 200 meters away, it's very different from if you're doing a doe call or a hind call at 50 meters away. Similarly, if you've got a young female that you're courting and she says, hey, I'm just at home, do you want to come around? It's very different to if she says, hey, I'm out the front, so like think about it that way, in the sense of if something's not working, one of the biggest factors that may change the sort of intensity of that call is purely how far away it is too. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to sell and paint a picture. Like think of yourself as an artist, and you're trying to paint a picture in that stag or that buck's mind using all the different audible cues to get them to come to your location because they desperately need to come to you. And that may be a defensive reason in the sense of, croaking, raking a tree, roaring, that type of thing. Or it may also be a lustful point of view, being like, hey, there's a I need to go and get that doe. I need to go and get that hind, and I would like to, add it to my harem or breed it or what on, so on and so forth. So, that's really the thing. Like I'll jump into a few scenarios and stuff now, but that's really what I wanted to sort of get to you, that it's like when you are calling, you are like, is the first step of calling is obviously just the location part of calling. But the second part, when you're actually going in to these dialogues, is it's like you are an artist, you're painting a picture in this buck or this stag's mind, and whatever call, like especially if you're calling it in to your location, whatever call seems to be working the best is the one that I would be using to try and get them there. So now I'll just try and like jump into some different examples and like especially break down like, I know that I'm going to get questions from people being like, okay, well, how do I know like if a call's working? And so we sort of discussed it a little bit earlier before where, you might be 200 meters away to a buck and you might be croaking and the buck may be croaking back at you. And all of a sudden, you've been doing that back and forth. Like you croak a couple of times, he croaks a couple of times, you croak a couple of times, he croaks a couple of times. And that's where it's really important to be sort of analytic when you're doing this calling. It's like, okay, well, firstly, like the biggest thing, obviously, which would be a negative. So it's all positives and negatives. So it's like the biggest thing, which would be a negative, is he either shuts up in the sense that like he stops calling because then you don't really know his location. And that's like one of the biggest things, obviously, with the rut and roar is like they call so you know that their location is like right in that gully or right on that ridge, blah, blah, blah. So if he shuts up, it's not necessarily a bad thing either, because it could also mean that he's moving into your position silently. So be careful and be ready for that. But the biggest negative thing is if he actually starts moving away. And we see that often more so with red stags because obviously fallow deer are holding a location. So they're willing to defend that scrape a lot more than a red stag. Like if you put pressure on a red stag, as we've discussed, he's more likely to just flee the country and go up over the hill and go into some other little safe pocket, because it's like, especially if he's got hinds. Like if he doesn't have hinds and you put pressure on him, then he may come in, and it depends on then the dominance of that stag. Like if he's a dominant stag, he'll probably come into your location and be like, hey, I'm a big boy, like I want to, let's fight. Whereas if he's a younger stag and you put a lot of pressure on him, he's sort of like, oh, I'm just sort of like feeling it out and just seeing, like I just want to like steal one of your girls, but I don't really want to fight you. God, that hurt. So yeah, he, so it just depends on what, like, yeah, if you put pressure on them, like you're obviously going to make them need to make decisions. Like if you're just sitting there doing location rule after location rule, not really putting pressure on a stag, then you're not forcing anything to escalate. And that's where, like with calling, it's very much like it can be something that you escalate and then de-escalate or just stop calling. But often it's like, it's got a pinch point where it's like, you sort of get the result that you want or you don't. And I mean, often, obviously, we don't. But this is trying to like share as many tips and tactics with you guys so that you can like get the result that you want to, I guess. But yeah, so the important thing with trying to analyze, like the thing is like the intensity of how they're calling too. So, going back to the buck one, like if you then introduce a doe call and he starts croaking frantically, then you obviously know that that's like what he wants to hear. So then that's where I would like start, doe calling more. But equally, like you may doe call and he may just like go and croak a couple more times, and okay, well, nothing's really working. I might just now move in silent. So you've done this calling exchange, and you may just go, okay, I may just move in silently now a little bit further, and then so just say you cut the distance from 200 meters, you now cut the distance to 100 meters or 80 meters, and all of a sudden you do another doe call, and then he just starts croaking like mad and runs up the hill to you. So it's just the things that you've got to play with is how, like, what calls you're doing and how close you are to them when you're doing these calls. And like I said, like a call at 500 meters is very different to a call at 50 meters. Same thing with a roaring red stag and stuff like that. You might have a red stag that you're calling to across the valley, and he doesn't, like you roar and he roars and you roar and he roars, but all of a sudden you hind call and then he gets really interested in stuff. And often it just depends. Like often I'd say incorporating the female calls in, so doing a doe call or doing a hind call, is the thing that I find that like works the best, and hence why we do it. But that's not always the case. Like I've had, especially depending on with red stags and stuff, and bucks, like depending on where they're at in the time of like I find that earlier on they actually respond more to like what male calls and stuff like that. Like, so I've had times where you're sitting there on a scrape or just off a scrape going ming, 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 ming. And they like, yes, they croak back at you, but then you start croaking at them, being with someone that can croak, and they go nuts, or you start raking a tree and stuff, and then they get really fired up. And same with red stags, like you roar at them and they roar back at you. You do a hind call, and I find this especially like with younger stags too. So if you're like trying to shoot if you're just trying to get your first stag on the deck, whether it be a bow or a rifle, like I find with younger stags and earlier on in the rut, like if you hind call, they sort of just blow you off, which is a bit annoying. And they're not like, they don't fully, I don't know if they don't take you seriously, that's probably not the right way of putting it, but they just don't react like how you'd sort of want them to. Like you're like, oh, this is going to be so good. Like they're just going to come charging in, and they're just like, nah, just nothing. They give you nothing. Whereas then you like go back to roaring, and then they go back to roaring like super aggressively and stuff. And you're like, what the hell, man? Like what's your problem? What's your deal? So yeah, but the point is, the fundamental thing is like what call's actually working to get them into your effective range, whether that be a bow or a rifle. And so there's a couple of different scenarios that, like I said, you're an artist, you're trying to paint this picture in the head. And so like you may be on one side of a gully roaring at a stag, he may be on the other side of a gully roaring at as well. And so it may not be going anywhere, but you may all of a sudden, like, and this obviously, like, you still got to take into consideration the wind. You've still got to take into consideration, if they see a human running down the hill or whatever, or like moving through, well, they're not going to be like, oh, I've heard a call over there. It must just be like, don't be that guy or girl. Like, if they see movement, they will know. Like, they're intelligent animals, and like and even then, like I think that I'm an okay caller. I still think that they can tell the difference, that I'm not like, I sound slightly different to them. You know what I mean? If that makes sense. Like, and I think I'm a relatively pretty okay caller. So like just take that into consideration, where it's like if you're that like slightly off call, and then they see, the first morning they get your wind because you weren't set up properly, and the second morning, they see you coming through the brush because you decided to stalk in after calling from the other side of the ridge and stuff. And like I just think it's like walking in with the head torch thing. It's like, how many times do they have to have something happen before they learn that that's a human, for example? Like how many times do they have to listen to this slightly off roar that's generally coming from the same ridge? And that's probably an important thing to talk about. Like I like to actually move around where I'm calling from at first light, because like if you've got one ridge that you every day walk out of camp on and roar on, well, how many days in a row do you have to do that before you roar and then you go and bust a stag or you go and bust a buck? And then like they put it together that when someone roars or croaks from that location, like 20 minutes later, some bloke rocks up on my scrape, or rocks up and, like scares my girls away or whatever. Like, so just take that into account and sort of mix up. Don't be patternable in yourself. Because they definitely learn quite quickly.
Need a caffeine hit? We've got you covered. Power your passions with OzCaff Energy. Designed to be convenient, discreet and portable. These small caffeine pouches pack a punch and will get you out of those lows in no time. Place one of the pouches under your top lip for rapid absorption, which will have you performing your best in no time. With added benefits of 0 calories and 0 sugar, there's nothing to lose. Use code TWINELEMENTS for 10% off your next order.
So going back to the analogy before where I said you're trying to like paint a picture and stuff, and you're working with, like obviously with red stags, we've talked about that time and tone, and you're building it up and stuff, but the stag's just not budging. Well, that's where obviously, like you can introduce a hind call from across the gully, and then if he really responds to that, just say, like what you might do is you might, like if you've got the cover, you might run around the side of the hill hind calling at this stag and see his response. Like he just might go absolutely nuts. Like he might start coming into you, but he also might start roaring and stuff. And like you've got to, there's so many factors here. But what I'm trying to say is like you're trying to demonstrate, like you're in a play, you're an artist, like what I said. So it's like you may run, like the image that I'm trying to put into your head right now is that there's a stag on one side of the hill, which is you. And there's a stag on the other side of the hill, which is hopefully another stag and not another hunter. And you're roaring at each other, and you've been roaring at each other, and you've been using timing and tone to escalate it up from, roaring pretty casually once every 30 seconds to you're roaring and he's roaring and cutting you off and you're cutting him off and you're just screaming at each other, right? But he hasn't committed and he's not coming in. He's hung up. Why is he hung up? Okay, all of a sudden, you introduce these hind calls. Okay, so the reason why I'm not moving to you, the actual stag, is because I've got hinds over here that I'm defending, and I'd rather just sit on this ridge and roar at you and say, piss off, mate, I'm staying here, I've got my girls, you stay there, whatever, if you come over here, I'm going to bloody murder you, blah, 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 we're going to have a serious fight. But all of a sudden you introduce this hind call, right, and you go, and like it's not going to do it that much, but you introduce hind calls, and then he starts responding really well. Well, you may run around this hill or down the gully towards him, hind calling, and what you're trying to, like in my mind, what I'm seeing is, okay, you've got a stag up on a hill, which is you with girls, and what this hind that's actually calling, who may potentially be an estrus, has just broken free, which I've seen happen like plenty of times actually being in the bush, and she is running towards me because me now being the actual stag, I'm this super sexy manly stag that she obviously has heard me roaring with her man for the last 10 minutes, and she wants to be with me, so she's running all the way across the gully. Little does he know that you're actually a bloke, most likely running across the gully, and you'd like to take him home and put him on your wall, but he doesn't need to know that. Like what you're trying to do is, so you're painting the picture that you're this hind that's just broken out. And so this is like, this is what I'm trying to get to you in the sense of like you're trying to paint that picture in these stags and these bucks' minds, equally speaking, because like what you're trying to do is call them to your location. So you're trying to see why are they hanging up, and you're trying to provide an excuse for why you may not be moving, and that generally means that you're introducing the fact that you've got girls, or it could also be the fact that it's like you're being defensive and stuff like that, but you're also trying to figure out why they're not moving. And so sometimes it's purely because they're a young stag or young buck and they don't want to like fight, often it's because they've got girls too. And that's why you need to then cut the distance into them, right? Whether it be with roaring or hind calling or anything like that, to then show that you're serious. And so like if you move in and you're roaring or croaking, then you're obviously going to elicit a defensive response from that stag or buck. And so they have then the option, and then that's where the distance that you introduce your roar or croak becomes very important. Because if you introduce your croak, like just say you roar at them at 500 meters and then you cut the distance to 250 and roar again, well, if they've got hinds, their instant response is that they're going to move away from you and try and get back out to 500 meters where they felt comfortable. But obviously, because you're giving them time to, react to you, and they're going to rather be defensive most of the time than be offensive and want to come and actually fight. Because why risk losing girls? Why risk using resources in the sense of, using up energy, which you could easily, fighting. Like, I don't know if any of you guys have done like a proper jiu-jitsu fight or something like that, or you've been a wrestler where you like full on grapple and stuff. But I can just imagine like the amount of energy that goes into that. Imagine being a 250 to 300 kilo stag fighting another dominant stag, and you're just sitting there like, clashing antlers and stuff like that. Like, that's going to use a lot of energy, plus the risk of losing the girls, plus the risk of, getting injured, your rut's over, potentially getting an infection, losing your life, all these things. It's like, it's so much easier to just run away. And so that's why with these red stags, especially, like what we've said, because they're nomadic, they're not held to a location. If you put pressure on a red stag and you're not close enough to elicit a defensive response, he's most likely going to run away from you. And so take that in the back of your mind, where it's like, okay, if you roar at 500 meters and you're just roaring and roaring and roaring, well, you might slip in there and straight away not roar, and you might just do a hind call. If you're someone that's a rifle hunter, then you may roar and they may roar back, and it may just be enough that you get them to move out of thick cover. Like, that may be the thing that you actually want them to do. If you're set up on if you got a good setup and you're shooting 200, 250 meters or whatever, confidently, you've been practicing, and you roar, and then he starts moving the girls up the ridge, all of a sudden you've got that perfect broadside shot as he goes up the ridge. Bang, congratulations, you've just got this magnificent, or hopefully magnificent red stag, or your first red stag. So it's trying to think into, obviously for bow hunters, you just watch them walk over the ridge with their girls, which is shit. So it's just trying to think about like what you're actually trying to accomplish. And if you're trying to accomplish getting them to walk all the way into your situation, then eliciting a defensive response most of the time with mature stags isn't going to work. With young stags and young bucks and stuff like that, croaking and calling, especially in those, and like we said, this all varies. Like it's and that's where it's really important to go back to the whole concept. It's like, you're an artist, you're trying to like see what's working, you got to play, you got to adapt to the situation. And that's why there's no, like, I can tell you from my very hard-earned experiences, because like this, obviously to get this level of knowledge, it's cost me a lot of fallow and a lot of reds, and seen a lot of fallow and reds run away over the hill. But yeah, like, as you can see, there's no like hard and fast rules, because I've just described this thing where 9 times out of 10, I personally find if you cut the distance on a red stag from 500 to 200 and then roar, and he's got girls, well, he'll most likely move away. But you may message me in a week's time and be like, hey, I did that on the biggest red stag I've ever seen in my life, and he was really feeling a fight that day. And so he came charging into 10 meters and you shot him front on, and he's the new Australian record red stag. You never know, right? And that's the beauty of calling. And that's why there's no, like, there's certainly sort of rules, but there's plenty of areas in the gray that we live, you know what I mean? And so it's just trying to set you guys up as well as we can to have all the knowledge, or as much as I've got, I guess, to then share that with you, so that you've got as much knowledge as you guys can have going into the rut. So you've got as many roaring tips as tricks as possible, but also what you can sort of anticipate the outcome's going to be before you even do it, just from my previously learnt experiences. So a couple of other things just to add on there and stuff like that. So we obviously spoke about, like, if a hind or if a doe, like these can be extrapolated to either buck or doe, obviously. Like if you got a buck croaking 200 meters away, like I said, and you're on one side of the ridge and you croak, 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 and he's croak, 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 and then you introduce the doe call and he really likes it, well, you can easily run off to him and be a doe that's broken away and, is moving in on his location as well. So, like these are transferable to and from. The biggest difference, like what I've said a couple of times, is that a buck will hold his location most likely, whereas a stag, if you put pressure on him, he'll most likely bust and start moving off. So, the next thing that I just wanted to talk about is sort of those like not typical calling ones. So using like raking a tree and that type of thing, especially with a stag. Like if you end up calling at 500 meters and then cutting the distance and getting into 100 meters, which is like 100 meters or less, is where we like to do these defensive calls from, especially with a buck or a stag, and you start calling and he starts calling, but he's like hung up and you just can't get him to come in. You introduce, generally from my point of view, and not to say that I may not even roar if I get into 100 meters. I may then straight away switch it from a hind call, from a roar or a croak, into a doe call or a hind call to try and relocate that stag again. Because I just find that it's like, if you introduce a hind call or a doe call, like you're not imposing a threat. It's very submissive. It's actually the thing that they're most likely looking for. So you generally get the better response. So I then cut the distance from a location, which is generally further away, into getting close quarter sort of calling. Generally I'll introduce a female call, do a hind call, and then the stag roars 100 meters away. If he's not coming to my location, then what I may do then, rather than actually roaring, if he's hung up and not coming in, I may move in closer again and try and I might even and they know where you are. Like they're so switched on. Like if you move even, and this is where I cup my hand and stuff too. So I'll cup, if I want to sound like multiple hinds, or multiple does, I'll cup my hand and send a call out to the left, and then I'll cup my hand and send a call up the hill, and then I'll cup my hand and send, like that you're a mob of hinds or a group of hinds chirping away at each other. It might be a hind and a fawn, or it might be a couple of does or whatever. And so using that hand to same with roaring. I'll roar in the analogy that I gave before, where I said there was a red stag roaring on a hill to another stag that you wanted to put up on your wall, and then all of a sudden the hind broke free and started running towards him. Well, right before I actually do that hind call, I'll face the other direction and roar. So it seems like stag A, which is you, roaring to stag B, which is hopefully the actual stag. He's actually moved further away, he's actually moved off. But then all of a sudden one of his hinds is broken free. And so you're trying to that's where using distance is really important. And one way that you can emulate that you put more distance or change the distance is using your hand to send the sound in different directions, even though you're standing in the exact same location. And so, with hind calls and stuff, or between stags, doing, saying that you're roaring and turning your body and roaring the different way, or croaking the different direction, or doe calling the different direction. They when you're at 100 meters, if you move forward 10 meters or 20 meters and then hind call at them, that could be the thing that just tips them over the edge and then gets them to come in. Then if they're hung up though and they're not walking, and you know that you haven't got that much cover, and that's another thing, just think about like what we said, we're trying to paint a picture in their mind here. But if they're not, if you're in fairly open country and they can see you, and you're and you're throwing out roars and hind calls, or you're throwing out croaks and doe calls and stuff, and there's and you're in this one tiny little thicket with 2 gum trees and one small blackberry bush, and they're 100 meters away roaring. Well, they're not dumb. They're not going to look there and be oh, I think there must be 20 deer perfectly lined up behind that one gum tree. Give them a bit of respect. It's the same thing. So you've got to think about that. And sometimes that's where thicker cover when you're calling can actually be better than more open country. Because they can obviously see easily a couple of 100 yards in open country. And so if you've got fairly sparse timber and you're trying, that's where contours and hills can be really good, because they can be oh, it must just be over that little rise is where they are. And often that's where you'll probably try and set up so you can have cover to draw back or shoot or whatever. But just, think about that when you're calling and stuff. And so But going back to like, if you move closer or in, then yeah, sometimes when you're in that really tight area, like some of these non sort of verbal in the sense of like, you know, a doe call or a buck croaking or a stag roaring or whatever can be really good. So raking a tree, especially if they're hung up and it's like, okay, well, why is this hind or this doe not moving into, especially if you're a doe, because obviously like we've discussed in the fallow deer podcast, like the does move to the buck. So he'll be on the scrape, normally calling back at you. And then it's just like, you know, he's sitting there in his mind going like, this girl is calling at me saying, hey, sweet big fella, come over here, like come to me. And that's not how it works. Like, why will she not come? Like, she's just run in from, you know, she's just left, or like, you know, you might have doe called at 300 meters. It's like, well, she's just run from 300 meters to 70 meters, but she's not prepared to come across this open flat and show herself. And then all of a sudden you start raking a tree with a stick. And it's like, oh, the reason why she's not going to come across over here is because she's got a buck that's just chased her all the way in, or another buck's just found her and he's holding her up right there. Oh, well, she's come from 300 meters down to 70 meters. So I'll just go over there and bash that buck and I'll see who this buck is and I'll take this girl away with me. And same with roaring stags. Like if you get in, I mean, this actually works really, really well with elk and getting them pissed off. But we'll talk about elk calling podcasts in the future. But yeah, if you get in there to like really tight, like they've got some really thick timber over there. And so you can get really tight with bulls, and like your shooting lane, like your maximum shooting lane is like 15 meters or 20 meters, which is actually a really pain in the ass thing that I learned when I was over there, because so many times we had like incredible bulls at like 35 meters and you can just like see them walking through the timber, but you can't get a shot, which just royally pisses you off. And so it was almost harder to find a shooting lane than it was to like sort of get these bulls to come in. But anyway, so yeah, getting like raking though, when you're in like sub 50 or 60, and it's the same thing with the red stags. Like, you know, this red hind has just run all the way in, apparently leaving this stag behind. I haven't heard him roar in a while. Why is she not coming in more? And then you rake and you're like, okay, well, clearly she's got a stag there. Who's the stag though? And that's the beauty of it. It's like it's like one of these very like passive things, because, you know, they can't become educated of a rake. Like they're not going to be like, oh, I bloody know that's Jimbo up there on the hill there, mate. That's his rake. I could tell that anywhere. You know, like it's just some bloke with a stick, or in what their mind is, you know, it's a stag with an antler just like raking a tree. So, you know, raking is really, really handy, especially as a passive or sort of fairly discreet calling technique, and it can just be the thing that tips them over the edge, because it is actually quite an aggressive, like, you know, when you're raking, like it's like sitting there in a club and, you know, you've just gone from texting a bloke being like, I know you're talking to my missus, you dog, you're a piece of shit, to being in the same bar as them, but you're across the bar and like they can't see you and stuff, but you know they're there, and all of a sudden, you know, you hear them start like, and I know this is a poor analogy and we're the king of this at Twin Elements podcast, so welcome. But it's like, then all of a sudden you hear them starting to punch a boxing bag. Like that's essentially what you're saying. It's like when you're raking a tree, it's like, mate, I'm G'ing up. Like I'm about to start. I'm getting ready for a fight. And so, you know, it can be a really powerful cue.
Cayuga broadheads are engineered for success and built by experience. These are the broadheads we trust for all of our bow hunts. Whether it's buffalo and bangtang bulls in Australia's Northern Territory or chital deer along the basalt wall, we have ultimate confidence in their range. I'm currently loving the 150 grain Zots. Regardless of your preferred broadhead, quality and performance is guaranteed across the range. If you would like to try them today or shoot them already and want to restock, head to their website and use code TWIN10. That's TWIN 10 numerically at checkout for 10% off your next order. You will not be disappointed.
Another one is like, you might be down in a wallow, for example. Like if I find a wallow, I'll often, especially if it looks fresh, I'll often, because they're normally in the really high, this is obviously red deer specific, they're obviously normally in a really high traffic area, and especially if they're fresh, like stags will sometimes have their own wallows. Like that's like, you know, stags often, it's a social area, so they'll often be frequented by a lot of animals and a lot of immature stags, but normally you just have one sort of mature stag using a wallow, and that's sometimes it'd be multiple mature stags. But if you roar, well, then you're almost in their bedroom. Like, they've left and they're out now hanging out somewhere. You roar, and then all of a sudden you're like, you get this guttural roar, and you don't have no idea, like, especially if it's a fresh swallow, they might be bedded 100 meters, 200 meters away. And then all of a sudden you're roaring, they're roaring, and you can start get a stick and pretend like you're pouring up the ground and stuff in the water and start splashing that water because, you're just trying to paint that picture because, and that's the thing, people are like, oh, I think you overcall and stuff. It's like, mate, if you start if you hear roaring and then hear I could play an audio clip of me roaring and then me doing a rake and then me, splashing at the ground, just say, and even you as another hunter, if you just heard the audio clip, well, I'm sure you're going to think, oh, that's probably a red stag. That's not James. So think about them where they're obviously less educated even than us in terms of cognitive function. They're obviously incredibly tuned into their environment and stuff like that, but they don't know the quadratics formula. So they're not that intelligent, they've just got basic survival instincts. And so you can't tell me that you're not going to trick them that they think that's a red stag. Obviously, if they see you scratching at the ground or pouring up the ground, or if they smell you and stuff, that's completely different, and they're going to obviously realize that you're most likely. But even then, I always wonder, do they think, oh no, that was a stag down there and then there was a hunter in the area, or do they think, and we'll obviously never know this, someone asked one for me one day, but do they think, that's a stag down there and a hunter, or do they just think that was a hunter down there calling as if it was a stag? And we'll never know, but it'd be interesting to know. But yeah, with all of this, summarizing this whole topic, like I've said a couple of times, what you do here in this calling sequence is completely up to you. And you can be as creative or missionary and mundane as you want it to be. And to be honest, from my personal experience, I think the more creative you get with it as a caller, generally the better you are as a caller, because you have more aces up your sleeves, and hence, you keep trying and trying and trying. There's guys in the US that are just they're just ravenous on it. They don't give up. They'll bugle at a bull. He doesn't answer, or, he answers, but he doesn't come in. And then they'll try a cow call, then they'll try raking, then they try this, they try that, they try different, they try leaving, they try coming back, and then all this stuff. And so that's where the more different tips and tactics and things that you try and you learn, especially if you're trying to target big mature animals and stuff, just do it and practice. And it's cool. Take a video camera, get some cool footage and stuff like that. And especially around with bucks and stuff, see what works, see what doesn't work, see what they do when you do this and what you do when you do that. And sometimes it'll surprise you. Like I said, 9 times out of 10, they might run away, but that one time they might run in, and that's the buck that's hanging on your wall, or the stag that's hanging on your wall. So, but I just to further reiterate the point, Remy Warren, who I'm sure everyone who listens to this podcast knows, I know I've got a huge amount of respect for him. But he described one day where a bull in the US in really thick bush got held up at 30 yards and it just wouldn't come. And he said that he got his Nalgene bottle and put it above his head to emulate a bull pissing. You know what I mean? And so that's what I mean. I've obviously never done that. I've never tried it. I've never been in a situation where I had to do it. Obviously he was in really thick bush, which is a key factor of that. Once again, going back to you're standing behind a lone gum tree here, a lone gum tree here in Australia, and you've got a stag at 60 meters, pinned down on your location, pulling out the Nalgene bottle at that point probably isn't going to work for you. But, it just shows you the creativity that you can put into your calling and your calling sequences, and how you literally can, you can write the script and you can do whatever you want. And so in that sense, you're only limited by your imagination. Obviously I've given you a few different ones here, whether it be, female or male factors, or sort of just more discrete ones and stuff, raking at a wallow, or especially raking a tree and stuff. But, you could easily do it. You could be a buck calling, or even a stag calling, and then introduce a doe or a hind, and then get out a set of antlers or a rattle bag and start rattling and stuff, and emulate, especially if it's been going on for a little bit, like, just say it's been you calling backwards and forwards for 10 minutes, and then you can emulate that another stag or another buck's just come in and they've started fighting. And that's what I mean. Like, you can paint whatever picture you want. Like, obviously you're trying to like do things that happen commonly. Like, I wouldn't be doing that all the time, because how often does a buck croak and then another one come in and then they fight, and then, the hind or the doe runs towards, like, how many times does this all happen? Well, not commonly, but how often does a buck have a doe have a buck have a doe, or a stag have a doe, or a hind? Well, fairly commonly, you know what I mean? So it's do the things that happen commonly, but like, you're also not limited and pigeonholed to anything. Like, you can paint whatever picture you want to. And so that's where I'm sort of going to finish the calling stuff around verbally calling. I just wanted to jump into like setting up and make sure everyone's all over that. But yeah, if you guys have any like creative things that you think of or come up with, obviously, as you can tell, like, I'm a very passionate caller myself. And so if you want to have, if you've got other ideas and stuff that you want to share with me, please share them, and I'll share them on this podcast or on socials. But for now, I'll say best of luck with your calling, and hopefully, it gets you guys in nice and close, or gets you the animals that you are chasing, whether it be a mature animal or whether it be the first buck or stag for you. So have an awesome rut. Camp Chef is all about portable cookware, without any compromise to power or efficiency. Their range of cooking options include pellet grills, a cast iron range, and portable cooking systems. For better food in the bush or at home, head to their website to check out the complete range today. So the next thing we just wanted to tackle was actually setting up. So if, like, obviously we said with calling in animals, you're trying to call them into your location. Luckily, during the rut, hunting friends are not usually too hard to find. And so often there's multiple people calling and hunting together, whether that be rattling or whether that be actually roaring or croaking or doe calling, hind calling. And so what we like to do is actually set up a bit of a triangle scenario. And we just wanted to run through this really quickly. Like, we've obviously described previously, and I don't want to touch on it too much, but like, so it was mainly around when, I think it was in the Fallow podcast with when you're setting up on a scrape to rattle and stuff. And a lot of these lessons and sort of rules apply whether you're calling in an animal or whether you're setting up. And this is like, it's the same with if you're calling in a fox or something like that. And that's where like learning how to set up properly becomes almost an art form in itself. And so that's where, like, I like what we said, I like to set up in front of a tree. I like to trust the camo that you're wearing. So we obviously wear Numa because we really like the pattern, and we find that it breaks us up really well. Like, it's actually got a fair bit lighter sort of patches in it, and I find it breaks you up a lot more than some of these really dark patches. But we like to set up in front of the tree just so we've got more vision, and also more generally range of motion and shooting options. Whereas if you've got a tree in front of you, then all of a sudden, like, 90% of the quadrant in front of you is already gone, really. So that's a really important factor. But so setting up log piles or trees that have fallen down, I really like setting up in, because I find that when an animal, firstly, it's got a lot of broken up sort of timber and stuff at different levels of decay. There might be some vegetation and foliage and stuff in there too, which further breaks you up. But I think that when animals are coming in, they look at that fallen down tree and they almost look at it as a whole entity, if that makes sense. So firstly, it breaks up your outline really well. Secondly, they're walking in and they just like look at it and they're like, oh, there's a fallen down tree. They're not like looking into that fallen down tree going like, oh, that looks a bit weird. Like, I mean, obviously if your camo is poor or if you're moving and stuff, they will. But as a general, it's sort of like, if there's a fallen down tree where I want to whistle or set up on a scrape or, roar or something like that, like that's probably going to be my go-to personally. But yeah, I like to be standing. Sometimes I'm kneeling. So then, especially with shooting lanes, so whether it be a red deer coming in or fallow deer off a scrape, whether you're rattling or croaking or something like that, I like to clear the shooting lanes like a couple of meters in front of me. With fallow deer, I won't go all the way into the scrape and clear it there, just purely because I've had bucks that have come in and smelt where I've been, I reckon. Like, they get like a little bit of a whiff and then just sort of like, they don't like sprint off like they've winded you fully, but they just get like a bit nervous and they don't like ever look at me. So then I can only just put it back to that. But certainly within like a couple of meters of you, like I'll certainly happily like snap full on twigs and branches and stuff, because at the end of the day you could be a buck or a stag. Like it obviously gives away your location very well, but you could easily be a buck, raking a tree or something like that and snapping twigs. So I also like to pre-range everything once again, make sure that you're fully set up. This is obviously mainly more for the bow guys, but still very important for the rifle guys in sense of knowing your range. And then I also like to clear my feet, especially if I'm standing like in that log pile or at the base of a tree or something like that, just because I can't think of how many times like you've just shifted your feet a little bit to like change your shooting lane and, you've snapped a twig or something like that. So I like to actually like sort of not full on sweep away, but definitely if there's like some bigger bark or branches and stuff like that, sort of like clear that out of the way. So I've got a little bit of a platform that I can move my feet and shuffle around if I do need to like swing my hips left to the right to change my shooting angles. But as I previously said, like during the rut, it's that fantastic time of year where camaraderie is really high. And often you've got a few people in hunting camp. You're hunting with a couple of mates that you may have not seen for a while. And so normally what you do is you get this situation where you've got a caller and a shooter, which is awesome, because what you can do is you can set the caller up. What we like to do is set up a bit of a triangle. So you've got sort of the head of the triangle. It's not like a perfectly balanced where all the angles are equal. It's sort of more of a long triangle in the sense that like, so you've got the point of the triangle where the animals like you're anticipating they're going to come from, whether that be because you've already roared or called to them or whatever, or whether it be because you're in a gully system and the scrapes just say whatever 20 or 30 meters below you, and you think that the animal's going to come from that direction. Not to say that they're guaranteed to come from that direction, but it's just the way that you think they're going to come. The next thing, the biggest thing to assess then is the wind direction. So if I am sitting and I'm assuming that the animal is going to come from my directly 12 o'clock straight in front of me, and the wind is blowing straight from them to me, well, perfect. What you can do is sort of set up more in a line, in a straight line where you've got sort of, the caller is away in the back, maybe 20 or more. It depends on how far, but depends how open the country is, depends on how far you set up the caller back. So if you're roaring in red stags and it's really open country, you might put the caller 50 or maybe even 80 meters behind you. Whereas if you're rattling in bucks on a scrape and stuff, well, you might have the caller right next to the person that's shooting. So it really just depends. But if you've got a caller that is roaring and stuff, especially or croaking or whatever, you may have them set up, even 10 or 20 meters just behind, just so there's that like bit of a gap, because sometimes an animal will come up to 40 or 50 meters and want to see what the other stag is or the other buck is and stuff, and they might hang up, especially in more open country, when they're like, I should be able to see this stag or whatever. And that's where if they hang up at 50 and you've got the guy or girl who you're hunting with just in front of you by 20 or 30 meters, well, all of a sudden that's still a 20 or 30 meter shot. You know what I mean? So well within most hunters' bow range. The other thing that we like to do is you set the person who's the hunter in this situation up in the best downwind position from obviously the scrape and stuff, but also where you think they're coming from. So if in this new setup, the wind is coming from my left to right, just say, what I would do is then set them up so you've got a straight line 12 and 6 o'clock between where you think the animal's going to come from. Well, I will set the shooter up at my, just say, 3 o'clock. So we'll set them up to your right, so on the downwind side, and you'll probably put them 20 meters off or 25 meters off, where this is mainly for bow hunters, obviously, with rifle guys and stuff and girls. You can obviously set up right next to the caller, like depending on your shooting lanes and stuff like that. It's obviously nothing for you guys to shoot 50, 80, 100 meters. Whereas this is obviously mainly for sort of tight quarter combat and dealing with bow guys, but definitely with the rifle guys, like you still want to be able to have good shooting lanes and make sure everything's set up before they're coming in. But with the bow guys, if you set up that 20 meters off to the right hand side with the wind blowing from the left to the right, well, firstly, if they do come straight in, if they walk a straight line from 12 to 6, then you're going to be looking at a broadside shot rather than a front-on shot, which, if you're at close range, a front-on shot can be very successful. It just may mean that they're less likely to jump the string if it's broadside. So that's an advantage there, but it also means that sometimes, especially with animals where they're a bit sus, or I find that they're a bit nervous, or they just come in for some reason. There could be multiple different reasons why they do it, but they come in slightly more on the downwind side. And I don't know if that's because they're like, oh, this could be a hunter. I don't know if it could be a territorial and dominance thing where they're like, I can't see what this buck or stag is, but I want to maybe get a whiff of him. Then they go, oh, that, they smell each other and stuff, and they go, oh, I know that's Bruce up the hill there, and here's a flog, I can go bash him easy as. And so especially if it's a hind or a doe coming into estrus, so there's plenty of things they can tell from scent, and so hence why they'll slightly come in downwind. But if you've got the hunter 20 to 25 or 30 meters off to the side, well, then you're probably looking at it like they're most likely not gonna, and I never say they're not gonna, because I've learned that in veterinary, but also in hunting, you say that something's not going to happen or something is going to happen, and you can almost guarantee that the opposite's going to happen. You just learn that with doing enough of it. And so most likely I'd say that, they're not going to do a 50 meter wide arc to come in full. But even then, depending on how open the country is and stuff like that, you still may have that quartering on shot. Even if they've come in 50 meters and you're 20 to 30 out, well, you're not going to have a quartering on shot at 30 or 40. But if you're 30 meters out and they come in on a 45 meter arc, well, all of a sudden you've got a quartering on at 15. You know what I mean? So before they get your wind that's blowing from 9 to 3. And I've tried to sort of use that clock face and stuff just to set up and hopefully make you guys understand. But generally speaking, having some hand signals too between you and a caller, just to say, let's abort plan and move forward, or I'm just going to creep forward a little bit, or yeah, he's coming, or yeah, call, or don't call, or stop, or rake, or whatever. Having some stuff where you hunt with these people regularly and can have some calls and a bit of an exchange set up can be super handy, where you just want to explain to him or her in a calling situation, call or don't call, or, just shut up and let them come in, sort of thing. And I definitely think the biggest one is when you've had enough and stuff like that, which, I mean, for a bow hunter can just be putting the arrow on a string, for example. You should always have an arrow on the string when you're calling. But yeah, and just, whether it just be saying, no, let's abort mission or something like that. Generally speaking, we like to be uphill of wherever we're calling. We just find that it's a lot easier to call game in, and they're less likely to see you if you're slightly uphill. It can also be a bit of a dominance thing with red stags and especially elk and stuff like that, where if you are calling a stag, and then you come up over the hill and they're below you, and then you start roaring and stuff back at them, it can be a bit of a dominance thing and then actually entice them to come up to you. But it's just more of a personal preference with managing the wind and thermals and stuff like that. Often the thermals are going up depending on the time of the morning. If they're not, if the thermals aren't going up and they're still dropping down, then I like to come in level, or position level with them, so they're going to be contouring the hill at the same height as me. I don't really like calling below, because I find that talking about them getting hung up and them being able to see, they can see just from the contour of the hill and the shape of the hill, and also availability to draw back and stuff like that. They can see a lot better. Obviously, you've got a lot better visibility if you're standing up on the hill looking down than if you're looking from the gully up. If you're trying to pinpoint where this buck is calling from or rattling from or whatever, or a stag roaring and stuff like that. So yeah, definitely being on the same level or above them is what you're going to want to do. But always make sure you give your dues too as well. And even if you do have a calling sequence and stuff like that, I can't think of how many times I've brought in, or especially with foxes and stuff, you've done a fox whistle, You think nothing's coming in, you've been there for 10 minutes, you go to pack up, you put your backpack on, you take the arrow off the string and you look up and here's a fox walking in. Equally with bucks, I can't think of how many times I've rattled in bucks, and you think nothing's going to come in, it's been 15 minutes and all of a sudden, you put your backpack on and here comes a buck walking in. And definitely same with red stags. Like just because the red stags all of a sudden shut up and stop calling, like I said earlier in the podcast, like it can be a really bad thing because it means it is 9 times out of 10 they've stopped calling and they've probably moved off, or they're just like, they've bunkered down and they're not calling anymore. And then you need to probably restart that whole calling sequence and stuff again, try and get them, engaged and calling back at you and stuff. But it can also be because they've shut up and they're covering country and they're moving into you. Like it's not often that they cover country without roaring, especially if that's sort of the tactic and how you've been communicating. But I've certainly had it with stags before. Sometimes I'd say even more likely to be the dominant ones where they, all of a sudden they stop roaring and then you're like, oh, where have they gone? And then they just pop up right there at like 20 or 30 yards and you're like, holy shit. And you're like, fluffing around, you're sending a text back to your girlfriend for the morning being like, oh shit, I just scared that stag again. And all of a sudden, so just making sure when you are doing these sort of setup calling and stuff, you are being vigilant, looking around. I can't think of how many times you're like interacting with a buck or a stag across the valley and you actually call another one into your location. And so that's where like just making sure that like, you've got a bit of cover around you. Like don't just be standing in the open holding your, I'm not going to say it, but try and actually set up in a spot where you're calling from all the time. Like, like even like obviously in the dark, it doesn't really matter because like if something walks up to you and bumps into you at 2 feet, well, you can't shoot it in the dark anyway. But as soon as it's daytime, then I generally try and have some form of cover around me. It's not that I always put an arrow on the string, but I'm definitely sort of like, I'm not just standing in the middle of an open bench with like 30 meters by 30 meters of cover, because you never know that there might be a stag or a buck like 50 meters away and they just walk out and they go, oh, look at this dickhead. So make sure you're always in cover when you're calling, and hopefully if you set up correctly and you use some of the tactics that we shared above, you can get some bucks or some stags into your location, have some pretty epic encounters. And like I said, hopefully have a bit of success, like whether it be this is your first rut or whether you've had a couple of ruts and just haven't found your success quite yet. One of the biggest things that we push in this whole podcast is resilience and persistence and just keeping going. So just keep pushing it.
Specialising in high-quality supplements and nutrition, from electrolytes and hydration add-ins to their wild bars, Atlas Wild helps to fuel our outdoor adventures. Their Regenerate lineup has been a game-changer whilst hunting up north in the heat and humidity. It's perfect for those on the quest for hydration when losing lots of sweat. With grape, lemon lime, blue raspberry and orange flavours, there's something for everyone. Another favourite of mine is their Fusion lineup. It's my go-to for rest and recovery towards the end of a day. It's perfect for a big pack out. Now available in peach iced tea and lemon lime flavours. When shopping on the Atlas Wild website, be sure to use code TWIN10. That's TWIN 10 numerically for 10% off your next order.
Well, I hope you guys have learned a heap about the podcast, whether it be about being an artist and actually sort of painting beautiful pictures in that buck or stag's head, or whether it be around setting up, calling with mates and the importance of setting up, because at the end of the day, I guess you can be the best caller, but if you set up really poorly, then you're not going to get the results and the outcomes that you're trying to. So, hopefully you've learned something from this podcast. I just wanted to cover it again, just to make sure that we hadn't left anything out. And once again, like if there's different tips and sort of calling styles that you've found to be successful, and things that you've learnt, definitely keen to please share it with us. Like please send us an email at info@twinalements.com.au, or send us a message on Instagram at Aiden or my personal accounts or the Twin Element accounts. Like obviously if you've got some more questions, please send through them with the title FAQ or whatever. But just in general, like if you want to have a conversation and send through, hey, I did this and this worked, like I'd honestly I'd appreciate the message. Like I'd love to hear from you guys, because I really, as you can probably hear and tell, I'm actually really passionate about calling in animals in all different species, whether it be chital deer, elk, red deer, fallow deer, rooster, whatever, like any pigs, like I like calling it all. I like that interaction. And so like if you've got some tips that you've found successful calling in, obviously mainly we're talking about the right at the moment, red deer and fallow deer, but if you've got tips and tactics for calling, whether it be to improve your setup game or whether it be improve your calling game, like I'd love to hear it. So please send us a message there, and equally send us any FAQs through on those social fronts as well. But just a couple of closing thoughts. So we've actually got some really exciting news. We've sort of, flirted with this concept with you guys a couple of times here on the podcast, but this coming Wednesday, the 26th of March, we are dropping our 2025 Northern Territory highlight reel. So for those of you that were at the Flow State Expo, you would have seen it. It's an absolute banger of an edit that we've put together. And it's actually what we will be launching our 20K YouTube subscriber giveaway on. So we've got a heap of people jumping in on that. So we're giving away an option site. We're giving away a pair of lower range of boots. The list keeps going on and on. We've got Atlas chucking in gear. We've got Ozcaf chucking in gear. We've got Dog and Gun Coffee chucking in gear. Like every time we talk to one of our ambassadors, they keep chucking in and making the pile bigger. So we will have it fully solidified by the time we do the giveaway in a couple of days, and you'll see it advertised across all of our socials. But there's literally thousands of dollars worth of gear going into this prize. So hopefully one lucky winner is going to grab all of that. What you need to do to actually enter the draw, so you need to subscribe to the Twin Elements YouTube channel, and then that Northern Territory highlight reel that I just listed. So that's going to be dropping this Wednesday, the 26th at 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. And what we want you to do is comment in 25 words or less your dream hunt and your dream species. So, for some people it may be going and actually hunting a bantang up in Coburg Peninsula, like what's highlighted in this highlight reel. For other people, it may be a tahr in New Zealand, or it may be a bull moose in Alaska, or it may be an elk, could be a massive muley, could be a kudu, could be a Cape Buffalo musk ox. There's so many incredible species around the world, and Aiden and I are obviously so enthused to go and experience all these incredible hunts, but share them with you guys. But we want to know what your dream hunt is, and so in 25 words or less, if you can comment on that post to enter. So you must be following and subscribe to Twin Elements YouTube channel, and you must comment on that post. And then what we're going to do is we're going to select one of the winners from the comments. Sadly, just for postage reasons, you either have to be in New Zealand or in Australia. Sorry to our beloved listeners through Asia, Europe, and the US. We're sorry, we're cutting you out of this one. But please keep supporting the podcast. But for those guys and girls in the South Pacific, you could be winning a prize worth a couple of $1,000s at this stage, and it keeps going up by the day. So stay tuned to that. Make sure you enter, and please like and comment the video, and also make sure you're subscribed. So we've also recently launched our Twin Elements website. So for you legends that want to keep up to date with all things that Aiden and I are doing in terms of media, we're also going to start doing blog posts. We've got recipes on there. We're going to do a newsletter. So also importantly, we've got prints. So we've had a heap of messages about that. So if you want to jump on and order one of the prints, there's a couple of different sizes. We were showing them off at the expo. There's a heap of different varieties and themes. So you could do like a US theme one. You could do like a Chital one. You could do an NT based one. You could do like all of the deer species. There's heaps of different varieties of posts. Make a great present. Not that I'm anticipating many partners in here are probably listening to the podcast. If you've convinced your partner to listen to this podcast as well, sir or lady, we really appreciate that you've taken it to that level. It might just be that you say, hey, sweetheart or honey or baby boo-boo, whatever you call your partner, please can you buy me a couple of prints for my birthday or our honeymoon or whatever. So we appreciate the guys that have and are buying prints because it just supports this network that we're trying to build in this podcast and community. So and just taking it one step further, I mean, if you guys, we get so many messages now, like it used to be every couple of days and it was a day, and now it's, like we're getting a couple of messages on each of our sort of platforms every day about people loving the podcast and rating it and stuff like that. So to those of you who have already done it, thank you very much. And yeah, if you guys could just, subscribe obviously to the podcast, leave a review, rate it. But for me personally too, if everyone on here could do me a massive favor and just refer it to one friend that doesn't listen to the podcast. It's incredible. So many people already still, we had so many people at the expo that came up to us and we didn't even know the podcast existed. And one of the easiest and best ways for us to get this news out there is simply by you referring it to a friend. So I'm sure that there's a friend out there. It could be a partner, it could be a loved one, could be just one of your friends in your hunting group that isn't listening to it. So if you guys can do us the massive favor, and it could be just through socials, it could be someone that you loosely talk to now and again and you might be catching up with for the rut. It could be one of your uncles or something like that you see, whatever, anyone that you think would learn or could learn a thing or two from listening to this podcast. We try to keep them very informative and try and keep them as very concise as possible. Obviously we do pack a lot of information here, so sometimes they do blow out, but if you could get one person extra to listen to the podcast, and all of a sudden the amount of listeners that we've got doubles. And so if you can do the personal favor to us and get an extra person to listen, that would massively help us growing this audience, but also just increasing the general knowledge base of hunters in Australia and across the rest of the world. So if you could do that, even if you want to send me a message afterwards after you've done it, I'd really appreciate it. So once again, thank you to all the support, all the love we've been getting. We are obviously putting a lot of work into it, Aiden and I, trying to grow the community around Twin Elements and the brand, putting a lot of media out there on the YouTube channel, but also here through this podcast and through socials and stuff like that. And it's only going to keep getting bigger and better. So thank you guys for supporting us. Make sure you jump in the giveaway, because that's a way that we can give back to you guys, and make sure you keep listening to and supporting the podcast. But hopefully you've learnt something and taken something away from this rut calling masterclass, and have some success out there this rut. I hope you all get that stag or buck of a lifetime that you've been dreaming of, or it may just be the first critter that you've ever got on the deck. So hopefully you can use some of the tips and tactics that you've learned from this podcast, and we'll catch you all next time on the Twin Elements podcast. Cheers, legends. Bye.